Welcome back, everybody. I hope you took the opportunity to take a proper break and not just sit at your desk and catch up with all the emails that undoubtedly you will have missed this morning. I should have mentioned at the start that we're active on social media today, and there's a hashtag that goes with the event, so please do use it. I have to confess that I have sent 2 tweets and haven't used it, but I will next time, and it's hashtag Scottish Planner Live, and that's capital letters for Scottish Planner and Live as well. So please go for that. Welcome back to our session on planning for a green recovery. So this session focuses on what a green recovery should look like, and we've actually got a really interesting range of speakers from a range of different backgrounds. And I think that's really important, that planners aren't just speaking to planners, we're actually taking views from lots of different people. So we've got 10-minute presentations from our speakers, and we'll then be in discussion. Now, you don't just want to hear from me, so please do use the Q&A function. If you don't ask questions, then all you'll hear is my voice, and nobody needs that. So to start us off, we've got Sarah Longlands, Chief Executive from the Centre for Local Economic Studies. She will be followed by Professor Mike Danson, Professor Emeritus of Enterprise Policy at Heriot-Watt University, one of my alma maters, and Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And finally, we'll have Stefanie O'Gorman, Director, City Economics, get my teeth back in, from Ramboll. So I'll ask Sarah, first of all, to kick us off. Thanks.
Hi there, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm sorry I haven't been able to hear the introduction, so I do hope you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you fine, Sarah.
Okay, great. You can hear me. That's great. Well, listen, thank you so much for the opportunity to come along this morning and tell you about some of the work that we've been doing on the subject of green recovery at CLES. CLES is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and we work throughout the UK. And our focus is very much on how do we create better economies? How do we encourage the creation of economies which are generative rather than extractive, where land is an asset for everyone, and where business, community organisations have an opportunity to thrive. And as a think tank, we don't just think, we actually do stuff as well. We work across the UK, as I mentioned, and in recent years, we've really led the conversation on community wealth building in the UK, and particularly in Scotland. And we've been really inspired by the fantastic work on community wealth building that is going on in Scotland, and the really strong institutional support you have for it in the Scottish Executive. And in Scotland, we've been working on a series of pilots of community wealth building in 5 areas, including Glasgow City Region, Fife, South of Scotland, Clonmacnoise, and the Western Isles. And we believe that our approach to economic development, which is community wealth building, has a really key role to play in supporting a stronger, greener recovery, particularly in Scotland. And so this morning, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our thoughts on how we believe that can happen. I've just got some slides, so I hope you can see these. So for us, we describe ourselves often as the National Organisation for Local Economies. And as I mentioned, we do a lot of work directly with local authorities and with local, what we call anchor organisations that are based in a place and have a really strong relationship with that place, whether that's through local employment, through investment, or simply because that organisation wouldn't work anywhere else, but have a direct relationship with that location. And we work with them to explore the power of their assets and their expenditure and their economic role, if you like, in that area, and how they can best utilise that to support recovery. And for us, the power of local is crucial when we talk about green recovery. And we've seen that in what's happened over the last number of years. So over 300 local authorities have declared climate emergencies since 2016. and many aiming to achieve net zero by 2030, which is a really extraordinary target. And our contention is that the UK government at Westminster cannot deliver net zero without that local action on the ground through local councils and through anchor organisations and their partners. And we're starting to see real innovation, both in Scotland and elsewhere, beginning to emerge at the local scale. And it's an opportunity not just to tackle the climate emergency, but to help provide the basis of a much fairer recovery. Because I think we would argue at CLES, and be interested to see what people in the room think, we would argue that for too long we've been trying to pursue a particular approach to economic development and economic growth. But despite our best efforts, we still have really high levels of inequality. We still have very high levels of unemployment, particularly in areas that have experienced post-industrial change. And there's something not quite right about the way that we're trying to develop and grow our economies. And we think, the challenge of climate change, the challenge of the pandemic is a real wake-up call. It's a real opportunity to change direction and start to adopt a different approach to economic development, to planning, and to the way that we intervene as a society in our economy. And some of the opportunities that we can see on the horizon are around job creation, around skills training and progression, around business growth, taking up the new opportunities in the green economy, tackling poor housing quality, and also the reparation of ecosystem and habitat management. And of course, Scotland is really well placed to take the opportunities of a green recovery, given the very rich natural assets that Scotland holds and ecosystems, both within rural areas, but also in urban areas also. You've also got a really strong institutional structure for a more integrated approach through, for example, the community planning process at a local level. And you've also got really strong political support across the board for a different approach, whether that's through the wellbeing economy debate or through community wealth building. And of course now, as Tom Arthur, it was great to hear Tom Arthur speaking earlier, a minister whose job title includes community wealth at its heart. So really good conditions and a really good opportunity to make the most of what could be a really green and exciting recovery. And also, of course, to deal with the climate emergency that if we don't deal with, will come back and really affect all of us and future generations. So at CLES, we would take a very much a community wealth building approach to this. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes just telling you about what community wealth building is. And community wealth building is something that we've been developing over the last 10 years, really since the last recession, when we had that huge collapse of the financial sector. And that was another wake-up call, a real kind of a moment to say, what can we do differently in the next decade? And I suppose one of the things that we've been doing at CLES is been trying to develop a different approach to economic development, which is about kind of building on what places already have. And what community wealth building does is it focuses on how you use the combined power of communities, businesses and anchor organisations like hospitals, like councils, like police and fire services, to really see how you can deliver social and economic benefits. And it aims to do that by leveraging the benefits for our local economies through support for small business and voluntary and community and social enterprise, through greater plurality of ownership. So trying to often lots of our assets and lots of our businesses are owned by massive organisations, and trying to see, well, how could we diversify our ownership more so that it's a more resilient economy in the longer term. And also thinking about how we can create stronger skills, training and decent work, because we believe, if people have strong skills, if they've got a decent job to go to, then that's the basis of a much healthier and a much stronger economy in the longer term. And the approach also focuses on existing wealth and assets and really thinking about development from within, rather than always relying on inward investment. And it also is about creating a more generative economy, an economy that generates wealth itself, as opposed to what might be termed an extractive economy, where wealth, whether that's in terms of rent, or whether it's in terms of property ownership, that money simply disappears from the area back into shareholders or absentee landlords. But how do you actually create an economy which generates the wealth and keeps it in an area, so that you're getting better local jobs and better support and growth for existing businesses. And it's also, I don't know whether you can see, the bottom of the slide has just been cut off, but it's also crucially, I think, about economic quality rather than simply growth. And I think that's probably something that planners really understand, that, you know, what we need to do is develop real quality in how we build and shape our places, rather than just simply the quantity, if you like. And that for me is crucial to this argument, because for too long we've focused on growth as the main outcome, as the end, if you like, instead of maybe focusing more on how we get there, the kind of means by which we achieve that, and the quality with which we develop our economy, so that the benefits and the long-term prosperity that we create actually are dug in and embedded in place, so that when we do come across a challenge like a pandemic or a recession, that the benefits don't just simply slip away, but are built on strong foundations. And let me just move to the next slide. So for us, that is encapsulated in the idea of this community wealth building, and it's got 5 main principles. Firstly, around finance. So how do we ensure that the flows of investment and financial institutions actually work for local people, communities and businesses? And we think that's also really important from a climate change point of view, about making sure that you're investing locally in the assets and opportunities that exist there, in a way which does no harm, which doesn't create further damage to our environmental systems, and in some cases could even enhance and support the reparation of ecosystems and habitats. Secondly, about workforce. So how do we increase the level of fair work, of decent work in our communities? People are getting paid a decent wage, enough to be able to feed their family and to be able to live a decent life, and one that really helps to support well-being at the heart of our communities. And of course, in the public sector and with public sector organisations, there's a real opportunity for leadership there to show how it can be done and the benefits of that in the longer term. Thirdly, about spending. So really trying to maximise the benefits that we can get through the money that we already expend. That we already spend in our economy, because public sector organisations employ people, but they also spend money in terms of buying goods and services. So how can we use that to really extract the maximum benefits? And of course, in terms of climate change, how can we use it to showcase and to create demand for net zero products in the short and longer term? Fourthly, around land and property, which of course is at the heart of the planning process, and how do we kind of start to think about maximising the value that local communities can receive from land and property assets? And of course that is going to vary depending on land values, and of course I appreciate the issues around economic viability as well, but really trying to start a conversation about how we can do that, even where the economic conditions are more difficult, and what other alternatives might be available in that context too, so that you're creating as much value as possible in its widest sense. And then finally, inclusive ownership, and that's really at the heart of the process. Really, how do we start to create a more generative economy where we have lots of different ownership models in play, and that includes existing organisations and businesses, but also new ideas which are coming onto the scene around cooperatives, about community land trusts, and the role of community organisations in being able to take ownership of assets and land, so that they can make good use of them, and make sure the benefits actually flow back into the economy. So they're some of the 5 kind of key principles of community wealth building, and we think they provide a really good framework, a perspective, if you like, a way of stimulating discussion and debate about how we can use these principles to think about a greener and fairer recovery in the longer term. And I just wanted to finish really by thinking about the role of planning within this as well. And for me, I think there are at least sort of 5 different roles for planning in thinking about a green recovery and thinking about community wealth building. First of all, I think there's something about acting as a convener. And this is what planners do all the time, bringing partners together to problem solve, to identify opportunities, and to use that kind of collaborative spend and influence to kind of unlock opportunities. Second of all, I think there's a really important role for public sector organisations, for private sector organisations in their supply chain to help create demand. So using regulatory powers, using ownership and using spend to help create the demand for net zero solutions. You know, for example, heat pumps is an area that I've spent a bit of time looking at. And we know that heat pump technology doesn't work everywhere, but it is a potentially useful solution for some housing stock. But yet there's a real kind of unproven market for it as yet. So, for example, we know in the UK there are over 100,000 gas accredited heating engineers, but yet there are only 600 accredited engineers to fit heat pumps. So there's a real challenge there, you could say, but also an opportunity to really unlock that demand, to show that heat pumps could be part of the solution, not only in terms of climate change, but to help retrofit poor quality housing and make those houses much more pleasant and safe and healthy for people to live in. So I think something around creating that demand. I've just given the example of housing, but there are many other opportunities in there too, particularly around community energy, which is something I know many councils in Scotland are already looking at. Thirdly, I think linked to that about demand, you know, encouraging adoption of zero carbon technology and how you can use local planning policy to encourage and showcase zero carbon technology, which again, I know is something that lots of planners across the UK are exploring at the current time. I think fourthly, the direct delivery of transition projects. So there are now lots of councils starting to look at how they can directly deliver net zero transition projects, whether that's around community energy or around net zero homes. And I think also a role there for supporting partners in other parts of the economy, whether that's other public sector organisations, for example, building of new hospitals, or new GP surgeries, supporting partners in the private sector as well, particularly if it's new inward investment, but also in the community sector. Lots of community organisations are getting on board with this and keen to play their role. So how can planning help support them to explore and to lead the way in terms of the direct delivery of projects that will help to contribute to that net zero target in the longer term. And then finally, I think a wider role around that placemaking, about setting out the strategic vision for a place and making the green recovery, making net zero really at the heart of that planning process, and really kind of setting the standard for what places want to see. And of course, a real opportunity to make the most of natural assets, both in urban areas and in rural areas. And that's been something that we've, excuse me, in our work in Scotland have really noticed that real appreciation for those natural assets, and think about how you can weave that in to your planning and placemaking strategy. Excuse me. So that sort of takes me to the end of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to finish really by just reflecting on the sort of legacy of planning in this country, because I'm not a planner by trade. My background is economic development, but I've spent a long time getting to know and to understand planning in my own research. And I've also been inspired by some of planning's real heroes, if you like. You know, I think it was Way mentioned Patrick Geddes in what she said. And my own favourite planning hero was Max Locke, who developed the first plan for Middlesbrough in 1946. And he argued that at its root, planning was about human beings and their welfare. And in the context of climate change, with so much at stake, that has never been truer. And I think planning has a massive and transformational role to play in helping us to come through this crisis. And the other thing that Max Locke said that I want to finish on is that dealing with the challenges of place is a really complex process. And I think for us, that's kind of where we're at the minute with climate change, with the recovery, with the pandemic. And that, you know, when we're dealing with the questions of place, that it isn't like just fixing a ship, that, you know, unlike a ship, we can't haul it into a dry dock and sort it out, if you like. But instead, we have to fix the boat while it is still at sea. And I think that is why planning is much more of an art than a science, and why it has so much potential to be able to help us deal with the crises of climate change and recovery in the current context that we face. So thanks very much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We want some questions from you, and I see questions are coming in, so that's really great. So without further ado, we'll move on to Mike now, and we'll have a bit of a discussion at the end. Mike.
Good morning, everyone. From industry, from academia, from the unions and environmental organisations, they decided very quickly it was about the demand side, about people as consumers, and importantly, people in communities. Over the 2 years of the Commission, how people who hadn't thought about place on the Commission gradually recognised that it was an important dimension to life, to the economy and society, and then argued it should be central. Okay, so planning came right into the centre, to the core of our thinking, arguments, and so forth. And the other bit of background, it wasn't just about inequity in the future, about potential gainers and losers from the move to net zero emissions. It was also about injustices now, and how could we take this opportunity of transition, of moving to net zero, how could we use it to overcome the existing injustices with regard to ownership of land tenure, precarious work, and so forth, and things like fuel poverty and the like. Jumping forward just for now to look at the Scottish Government's response to the report or our report recommendations. It was interesting that embedded into the response and now in coming through in their own documentation is that although there has been just transition planning elsewhere in the world, it's tended to be fairly limited in scope. It would often be about just looking at the workers who lost their jobs. Very important, yes. Or it was about particular regions or sectors and looking at how to phase them out. So quite limited number of ways. And that quote from the government's response at the bottom there, they see a just transition planning framework as being a tool, an instrument to give direction to many different organisations, industries, sectors, and so on, in their role in helping to transform the economy. And that final sentence, and I've added emphasis there, the planning framework could form the basis for communities, business, site and regional planning to be spearheaded by those best placed to take those plans forward, i.e. planners in particular. Hence today's conference and attention. Okay, so we have 3 reports came out: interim, green recovery, and the final report. The chair of the commission, Professor Jim Skia, lent me some of these slides. It was interesting what he took as an engineer, scientist, and so on. What were the emerging themes from our first report? Planning, engagement with society, building equity, and therefore actually intervening, interacting. So it wasn't about the big industries and emissions and so on. They formed the basis for all the work. However, planning and working with people, he saw and we saw collectively as critical. Like a number of other advisory groups and commissions last summer, because of COVID, we were asked to have a look at a green recovery. What would it entail? What might we do? And the way on the Just Transition Commission we got our thoughts together was around identifying certain hotspots. In the end, we focused in on 4. One was make the big impact on young people. You know, schools were shut, universities, colleges, and so on, getting that first job in your career. And we'd already recognised that young people were making up a big part of the precarious workforce. And here they were being hit by these other impacts of COVID, but also commuting patterns were changing, and particularly for young people, more working from home. Many people who are in better paid jobs actually saved a lot of money last year because they weren't having to pay for commuting, lunches, etc., etc. But we also noticed that there were changes in transport use. People were reluctant to use public transport, far more likely to drive to work if they were going to work. How long would those behavioural attitudes last? What would be the implications? Should we be investing more active travel? Well, those first 2 are about planning, critically. The third one, what do we do in coal-fired power stations and mining ended? We tend to get rid of all the infrastructure there, the superstructure. In the oil and gas sector, quite a lot of that infrastructure we want to keep because it's going to be useful in the next generation of tech to move to net zero. And maybe for pumping hydrogen into people's homes, into businesses and factories and so on. We might reverse flow the pipelines from the North Sea to put carbon back under the North Sea and so on. So again, it raises questions that are different from before for planning and others. And as Sarah said, the rural economy, as much as urban, will be affected by moves to net zero, and building on investing in communities and our natural capital is going to be very important. The final report, and again, what we might have expected in a Just Transition Commission, it would focus on the industry only, but actually we had a broad scope looking at energy, housing, transport, and so forth. We made 27 recommendations to Scottish Government. They accepted every one of them. Made us think maybe we should have had more. And we gathered them together under 4 key messages. Firstly, about orderly managed transitions, when the problems in closing mines, getting rid of coal-fired stations, and so on and so forth, and in Scotland, steel, heavy engineering, there wasn't that forward planning. So we said we need to plan. We need to have strategies at all levels, and it's a national mission. It involves everybody. We need to equip people with the skills, training, and so forth. So we need retraining for existing workforce, for new people coming in, younger people, but also for those new careers, new jobs that will be created for the new sectors that net zero will create. The third key message was about empowering and invigorating communities. So it was about recycling, reuse, repurposing. It was about 20-minute neighbourhoods and so forth. And that one in particular will come back to inform the basis of the rest of the talk, because that's where planning really comes in. And again, about equity. Make sure that everybody has the opportunity to benefit from the move to net zero, and make sure that those who are best able to pay do so, and those who are least able, those who are most vulnerable, don't have to bear the burden of the move to net zero. I gave a talk to the annual conference of economists from government and academia in Ireland a couple of years ago, and they were fascinated at the really deeply embedded plans and structures and so forth that we have in Scotland. We have many plans and strategies. They all interlink, at least on paper. We may have major questions here about implementation, but they're appreciated around the world for suggesting we have a very structured approach to Scotland's issues within the economy, planning, society, and so on. And so this diagram's taken from the Scottish Government's response to the Just Transition Commission reports. And you can see there that just one part of it, of a much bigger diagram, re-embeds planning into a bigger infrastructure, superstructure of planning in Scotland. Okay, so I drew attention particularly to the third of the key messages we had in the Just Transition report. What we argued there was that the Scottish Government needs to develop a consistent and ambitious approach to planning for net zero. The response, which came out a couple of weeks ago, has got 49 references to planning, and in particular it proposes this national Just Transition planning framework, which they are to be the first in the world. Again, it's based around the same 4 themes that we had in our report, our final report in particular. The first, and this is their own words here, planning for a managed transition. So planning again is right up there at the first. When they talk about education retraining, they've picked up on some of our discussions, saying that we need to train and retrain some of the professions, architects, planners, as well as gas engineers, roustabouts, off-the-regs, and so on. So the implications, the need for change to move to net zero goes right through the Scottish economy and society. It's not just about closing down some big industries. Involving those who are going to be impacted by Just Transition in particular, co-design, collaboration, planning. And again, we'll focus in on that next. And then again, spreading the benefits of transition widely and making sure the burden doesn't fall disproportionate on those least able to pay. Okay, so for planners, for RTPI, it's that third theme that's most important. And these are the headlines that come out of the Scottish Government response to our report and so forth. And again, you can see in there various aspects of planning. I won't go through them all, but regional land use partnerships, the first 5 pilots are going ahead at the moment to look particularly at rural Scotland. How can we bring different social partners together to be planning for the future of those areas, future of land use, and right embedded in there is the move to net zero, involving citizens more in various ways. And then they pick out particular aspects of the economy, society, energy, local food strategy, local food plans, improving the supply chain. And again, that reflects somewhat on what Sarah was saying earlier. The key response, which is embedded with all those, brings right to the heart planning. So firstly, going back to what we said in the Green Recovery report, changing commuting patterns and so on, and how young people particularly are impacted. And therefore we see free bus travel is right in our fares review. We heard in the introduction about the national planning framework is imminent, it's coming in the next couple of months. And the government say explicitly they're going to define the 20-minute neighbourhoods, talking about planning our places. And I've put in bold there, new emphasis on living locally, giving life to the place principle, supporting public health and well-being, reducing inequality, strengthening community resilience to the impacts of climate change. So Just Transition and planning are right at the heart of government going forward. And then that final paragraph will support planners with spatial data research tools so that you can work collaboratively with other social partners in delivering the 20-minute neighbourhood principles. Place standard tool for community, placemaking, spreading learning, and so forth. And then I've put in bold at the bottom there, once approved and adopted, National Planning Framework 4 will have development plan status, meaning its policies have a stronger role in informing day-to-day decision making in planning. So planning has been thought about, yes, by us on the Just Transition Commission, but more importantly by the Scottish Government. It's in their plans for government going forward and so forth. The meat on those plans will come from a number of different sources. As I said, the Green Recovery we did last summer sat alongside many other green recoveries by the trade unions, by business organisations, by Benny Higgins' economic renewal group, etc., etc. So we can expect a lot of organisations, institutions in and out with government in Scotland pushing for policies, strategies, plans going forward. And just to pick on a couple of them, the two main partners who requested a Just Transition Commission with environmental organisations on the one in Scotland and the S2C and the trade unions on the other. The S2C has been focusing particularly on green jobs going forward, as you might expect. And we can see, if you can't see there, in quite a thick report, how planning will be important, for instance, for delivering their aspirations for a just transition for workers and so forth. If we take another organisation who's written a lot on Resilient Scotland, a just transition, Common Weal, for instance, planning appears in almost all of their thoughts and plans going forward. Okay, so just to summarise everything, the importance for planning for the RTPI of a green recovery. First of all, I think, as Sadie was saying before, as we heard from the Minister and others, that, and as in the government's green response, the government's response to the Just Transition Commission reports, there are big implications for planning in terms of finance, localism, energy, food, and so on and so forth, because it talks about a lot of them being at the local, the regional level, rather than relying upon national, international supply chains, which we're seeing are breaking down because of Brexit, COVID, and so on. Far more attention to the local, to the regional. So as well as those traditional things of transport, housing, zoning, and so on, we're also seeing planning being brought in to be more involved in these other aspects. And therefore, it's very much a dynamic, a changing environment for planning, for planners and so on, because we're going to see strategies, plans, policy evolving over the coming years. The government's response, their initial plans, the national planning framework and so forth aren't static documents. They're going to be added to, changed, interpreted, and therefore there are going to be consequences, interactions, which themselves will continue to change the environment you're working in. We're going to hear far more about community wealth building, community benefit clauses, and so forth. And we made a big thing of talking about supply chains and rebuilding those more locally and regionally and at the Scottish level in our reports. And that has implications for procurement and so forth, and rethinking a lot about how local government, how other organisations actually relate to the economy society in much more proactive ways than before. Working with communities across silos. And as we've already heard, and you all know, planners are very good at that. They do it to a great extent than many other parts of local and central government. And a lot of it's about working with other social partners, public, private, the third sector, and so on. And then I've just taken a quote, which could have been from the Just Transition Commission. It's actually from the government's response. And it says, planning can and must go beyond these high-emitting industrial sectors. So it's not just about oil and gas and cement, petrochemicals and so on. It's about all sectors of our economy, all elements, all people, as consumers, workers, and so on. Because everybody needs to be involved in creating a transformed and net zero economy. As I said, planning will be right at the heart of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Just to let our audience know, we're going to, because we've only got 2 speakers in the next session, we're going to let this run on a little bit longer. So I hope our speakers don't mind, and we'll keep you a little bit past 12 o'clock. But our final speaker is Stefanie O'Gorman. Stefanie, you're up next. Yep, we can hear you. Thanks. I'm not getting any sound at the minute, Stefanie. Are we experiencing some sound problems? Sorry, folks, bear with us a minute while we see what we can do here. Oh, heard something there. Stefanie, are you there?
I am here. I am here.
Excellent.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thanks,
sorry, everyone.
What a relief. Off you go.
You just go. I don't know. I'm pressing all the buttons. So apologies. So Stefanie O'Gorman, I am a Director of Sustainable Economics at Ramble. I was just saying there, I thought I was going to have to speak very, very quickly. But if we're running over a bit, that gives me a bit more time. So I can't thank Sarah and Mike enough for setting me up because absolutely everything they both said is very relevant to the background to the work that I'm about to talk about on 20-Minute Neighbourhoods. So some of you may or may not be aware of who Ramboll are, or you may be aware of us in a slightly different context. So just to explain, we're a Nordic heritage business, a foundation-owned business, and we describe ourselves as sustainable society consultants, and I find that very difficult to say in my Irish accent. But you know, the creation of livable places, I think, is the core bit of what we do and what we deliver with sustainability at its heart. So you will all no doubt have heard much about 20-minute neighbourhoods and what that means. This is Scottish Government's definition, where people can meet their needs within a 20-minute walk from their house. So it's a pretty simple concept. People talk about 20 minutes, other places talk about 10 minutes, 5 minutes. You know, the principle is exactly the same. So why we did some research back at the start of the year, published in March for Scottish Government. And the background was really, oh, I've lost my slide deck. Can you guys still see my slide deck?
Not at the minute. Maybe the team can help. There you go.
Oh, thank you very much, team. So to research to really think about the climate emergency, that was the premise. The research was commissioned through Climate Exchange, and particularly to look at the underlying policies around climate change plan, the program, the upcoming at that point program for government, things like the Town Centre Action Plan and the place principle, which Mike talked about, and the place standard. This work was very much an initial piece of research, but I think we can talk about how it's developed since we published it. So the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods for us has 3 elements. In order to be able to perform as a 20-minute neighbourhood, you need the things in the neighbourhood that you need. So you need to be able to access schools, and you need the infrastructure, and you need the doctors. But they also need to be of a certain quality to make you use them locally. So the quality and the experience that people have with that interaction is critical to the performance. But in addition to both of those things, we absolutely need engagement and behaviour change in order to deliver this. I think that is the critical third element of this going forward. So our work looked very much about aligning with the place standard. So hopefully you're aware of that. If not, definitely look it up, because place standards is a fantastic tool for the engagement process with communities. So in principle, it's designed in order to do that as a participatory process, and it gives you outcomes based on perceptions. And I'll talk a bit more about where I think we could add to that now going forward in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods. But it aligns, our definition as we've developed, and as I'll show you now, aligns absolutely with that. And I also know the place standard is being rolled out across Europe and in other countries being tested and trialled. So it really is quite an exemplar for Scotland to show its worth in this space. So if you can see this slide properly, the definition that we have, or the elements, I suppose is the point, to 20-minute neighbourhoods are listed here in these kind of themes. So we talk about civic spaces, resources, movement and stewardship. And within that, we include things like social interactions, but also natural spaces, streets and places, things like traffic and parking, which you might expect, but also influence and sense of control. So it's really quite a broad-ranging definition of what we would need in principle in an area to enable it to perform as a 20-minute neighbourhood. And I think in terms of the outcomes of that process is, you know, we talk about improved livability and quality of life, and Mike and Sarah both talked to that very much. We also talk about climate action. Decreased health inequalities, I think, is a significant outcome, beneficial outcome, and the improvement in the local economy. So they're the kind of core elements that we see being able to be delivered through this. So what we did, we did a baselining process whereby we took the whole of Scotland and mapped the current provision of services and based on our definition onto Scotland. Now, I'm obviously not expecting you to look at this table to be able to read it, but it is in our report, and I'll give you a link at the end. But it considers both that physical presence of a feature, but also that quality element, and I think that's the critical differentiator here. This map doesn't just show where there is stuff; it tries to identify the quality. Now, clearly, those quality indicators are very difficult to get at a national level. This work can absolutely be updated on a local basis with much more localized data, which would allow a much more nuanced picture. But what it allowed us to do was to really understand the opportunity, and critical to that opportunity, I think, is the discussion around urban and rural. And I'll get into that a bit more later, and I know Mike touched on that as well. So in addition to the baselining, we then looked at lessons learned. So we looked around the world and said, well, what is everybody else doing? And, you know, I think we've seen a lot of examples, like I said, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes, but a lot of examples around the world. But what we haven't seen is national application of those. So really what exists is places being led by mayors commonly or very strong local leadership to enable this. But what we haven't seen is a country saying, we're going to do this and we're going to do it across the board and we're going to do it fairly across the board. So I think that was really interesting. Another critical element and building again on what Mike said was that public participation is absolutely vital to the application of this. The realization, I think, is probably the proper word. As planners, I'm sure you will all be aware that there's nothing in 20-minute neighborhoods that's actually new. I think really what's happened is that the pandemic has made us appreciate our local environments more, and the climate emergency has made us realize the need for action a bit more. And collectively, they have recreated an impetus around this agenda. And that element of public participation in that and engagement is absolutely critical. And we see that from all of the lessons learned. There's no one size fits all here. Everything in terms of the solutions are bespoke, and that means that is why the public participation is critical. But also, we found other areas like Melbourne looking to Scotland and picking up aspects like the praise principle as fundamental to this. And again, that shows some really strong global leadership in this for us. So I just pulled out some specific measures we had come across from other places. But so Melbourne talks about neighbourhood activity centres, which I really like. And that's about densifying a place and pulling people into that so that you can create that life and vibrancy and deliver services in an efficient way. But other things like dual shop fronts. So for rural areas where you use a shop front to activate a space, but you also have an online presence so that actually the reach of that business is much greater. So we outlined some ambitions as a result of this work. That was our task. And, based on what we found and our baselining work, we really feel that Scotland can be a global leader in this concept. And that needs to be across urban and rural areas. We had lots of discussions around this being just an urban conversation, and it really, really isn't and shouldn't be. And underlying, with all of the just transition discussion that we've just had, it is vital that this is not seen as just an urban opportunity. And maybe the solutions in rural areas for sure are different, but that doesn't mean the opportunity doesn't exist. So every neighbourhood, we believe, should be facilitated to do this and empowered to do that. And there's a lot then to be said around what Sarah was talking about that localism agenda to really get us to a place where every community really has that. We believe the concept should enable people to travel more actively for their health and well-being. And when we think, particularly in rural areas, but not solely, about fuel poverty and transport-related poverty, it's really important that we look at opportunities to solve that and to reduce that overall burden on people, so that they can live better quality lives and gain benefits in terms of health and well-being. And really, the ambition, I think, also is that and as Mike pointed out, in terms of the planning framework, what we are seeing is that now coming through as an umbrella, and really enabling us to pull together the varying policy agendas within a place and deliver them under a coherent banner. So we had a number of recommendations come out of this. The use of the fourth national planning framework is critical in this, and we have seen that now being realised, which is fantastic. We believe greater emphasis on reducing private car journeys is really important, and this is a key part of the climate change plan update. We're expecting Transport Scotland to deliver their route map to reducing car kilometres by the end of the year. So no doubt they're all working very hard on that. We see the definition of a concept and a framework and funding for this at a national level, but the ambition and the delivery and the participation needs to be local. So we need a top-down, bottom-up type approach to this in order to maximise the opportunity and really to enable those communities to deliver, because you can see how difficult it is on a local level to navigate any changes. And if that national framework is clear and consistent and funding is clear and consistent, then that absolutely gives greater opportunity. And just that little graphic there, I just wanted to point out associated with the National Planning Framework, just linked back to those community activation centres or neighbourhood activation centres. You know, the idea that we zone vertically, not just horizontally, is really important here. And we think about how we live in places and how we use space differently, and how we facilitate aging populations and multicultural populations, and really look at that densification in a different way. And we had some really interesting conversations with planners and others, architects and everybody else throughout this process. And one comment which really quite worried me was the idea that actually giving planning to something different is not good. So you look at a community or an area and you plan for what is already there. If we continue to do that, we will not achieve our goals under a 20-minute neighbourhood, and we will not achieve that sustainable development that we are seeking through the planning framework, because the existing fabric, the existing communities were not designed to do that. So I think we need to be really brave in how we plan going forward, and we need to think outside our existing building stock and look at what new looks like and what it should look like for the future in a very different way, in order to enable us to deliver this. So there was some other very kind of much more focused recommendations around demonstrator areas, which have now begun. So Edinburgh started lots, and Glasgow has some, and there's some going on in rural areas as well. Interestingly, we talk about walkable neighbourhoods as 20 minutes, but that's based on an 800-metre walking distance. That is kind of standard, but actually we don't know if that's the case. That is actually what people would walk in Scotland. We also don't know if it varies by place or by rural, urban, and we don't know anything about that visual perceptions in terms of what people are prepared to engage with, so that we can then improve to maximize the opportunity. So we suggest here a national survey which gives us some localized data on that, so that you can nuance around it. The development of the baselining work is really important, and I think there's real opportunity in taking that and localizing it much more with better data. And there's a recommendation there to look at the place principle and how it's actually working in local authorities now, and whether there are barriers to that and how they can be overcome. So that was a speedy through. Hopefully we still have enough time for questions, but there's contact details there and the link to the report. Just Google 20-minute neighbourhoods and climate exchange, or 20-minute neighbourhoods in Ramble, and you'll get the details. There's also other information online around it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steph. We're going to push the next session back just a little bit. Our speakers are okay with that, so thanks very much to our next slot. So we've got time for a couple of questions. If I could ask all of our participants to put their videos on, so you can all be picked on, as it were. And I'm going to start with the first question that we were asked in this session, because it seems only fair that the first person who's waited patiently gets an answer. And it's from Martin Elliott, who's asking, is planning resource too focused on policy making and responding to planning applications at the expense of proactive and imaginative place-based implementation?
Barbara, can I just ask before we answer, can we get the slides off so that, because I'm just staring at my own name.
Maybe the team can do that. Yeah, there we go. In all our glory. So I'll just repeat that. Is planning too focused on policy making and responding to planning applications at the expense of proactive and imaginative place-based implementation? If you don't mind, Sarah, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for the question. I think it's a difficult one, because inevitably there's the day-to-day work of doing planning, which a lot of which is about reacting to applications and trying to get through the applications, particularly in areas where there's high demand. And I know at the minute, when you've got construction sector booming, there's probably a bigger demand than has previously been as a result of what we've seen during the pandemic. So inevitably that takes a lot of time, and I feel that often the other biggest challenges around funding, which the Minister mentioned, a lot of planning authorities have seen funding really cut back, which reduces the capacity to deal with some of these kind of wider, more kind of strategic decisions. So I think we have to accept there's a reality there that planning is trying to deal with. But at the same time, I think planning has such an important role to play in this agenda that we do need to give planners the space, the time and the support to be able to think big and to be able to wrap their heads around what needs to be done, and to use their convening power to create the opportunities for people to have these conversations and to think more generally about what type of places we want to build and what type of how do we use land in that context to build a better type of economy. So I think it's absolutely vital, and I think that there has been, I think, a trend over the last 20, 30 years of planning not having that space to think more strategically, to think in a bigger way about what kind of places we want to live in. And I think it's hopefully the reforms that we're seeing in Scotland will help to provide a bit of support in that regard and allow planners to kind of get back to some of that bigger place-based thinking that is going to be so important for green recovery.
You all talked about collaboration and also the importance of local communities and driving that, and obviously the time and space to make that happen is quite important. Mike, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I was speaking at a totally different event yesterday evening on Sky remotely, and that was one of the final questions. Does anybody have any hope and so forth? And I say, yeah. Listen to the people. I think we saw during COVID that local people, they followed the rules on lockdown very, very carefully. I'm actually in Johnson at the moment, live right beside a very deprived neighbourhood. I didn't see any breaches. When it started to lift, people came out and they worked together to clean up and so on. So, and there's a lot of citizens' assemblies been established in different places around Scotland. Listen to them. People are in some ways ahead of the curve. They recognise we need changes. Unless there's leadership, then they'll think we can continue as we are. But they're more than happy, in my experience, to actually push ahead with some quite fundamental changes. And as Stefanie said, I think we have a lot of inertia in the built environment, in patterns of work and shopping and so on. We need to address those, and you have to do it with people.
Barbara, can I just jump in on that as well? Just so I also sit on the Climate Emergency Response Group, and this is a kind of a private and third sector lobby group, essentially, to Scottish Government. But yesterday I chaired a session with the MSPs because we've just published 12 proposals to Scottish Government to act on the climate emergency, and one of those is related to planning. So I'd encourage people to have a look, cerg.scot, and look at the planning recommendations, because it is, you're absolutely right, that issue between the constraints of time and pressures and planning applications and a space to think. And direction is commonly what the day-to-day planning guys need, that they need that direction and they need that leadership. So we need to see that, but they also need the resources. And so SERG have called for both of those things immediately as possible. But so it's worth having a look at those proposals.
Thanks. We've got a question here from Kirsten Leckie. It's specific around renewable energy projects, but it touches on things that you've all said around community ownership. So how can planning support achieving inclusive ownership for communities through shared ownership of, in this case, the question is specifically renewable energy projects, but I'm not necessarily going to restrict you to that. Sarah, by all means, kick us off. Yeah.
I had a quick thought on that. So later this month, it'll be the end of October, we're going to be publishing a series of case studies of where community organisations have and public sector organisations have done some interesting work to look at community ownership. and community energy specifically. So that I can certainly pass on the details of that when it's published. But two of the examples in there, one is the Plymouth Energy, which is a community renewable scheme and it's been supported by the local council, and that has been about a sort of partnership between the council and community organisations in trying to get a community renewable scheme up and running. So that's an interesting example that I'm aware of. But I'm sure there are. I realise that's in Plymouth, the other end of the country. I'm sure there are many other more relevant ones in Scotland. But I can certainly pass on the details of that publication because it does have a lot of useful advice.
That's great, and it makes it look like it was a planted question. How clever is that? So you all talked about collaboration. So building on that, do you think that partnership between local authorities, public sector, private sector, and communities is going to be ever more important, Mike?
Yes, indeed. that was embedded right the way through the Just Transition Commission reports, for instance, but we also see it in some of those other institutions who and advisory groups who are publishing over the last year. Just touching on the renewables in that context, it was in one of the case study visits was to Aberdeen Heat and Power, and that's where the council, the community are, putting district heating into council housing, into old folks' homes and so on. You saw the real change in people's lives. But across the road, literally across the road from where one of the energy sources was a brand new student accommodation block. And we asked, well, are they on the scheme? No, the developers didn't want to know. That is a very, very typical sort of building, along with hotels and communal living, where district heating would have been ideal. So who wasn't joining the dots there? Is that the role of planning, of building regs and so on? But it's clear they tried to have the conversation and the developers didn't want to know. And it's on the news today, we need more student accommodation built. It's boxes. It's ideal for that sort of conversation to happen.
That speaks very much to Stefanie, your comments about it needs to be top down and bottom up.
Yeah, and absolutely, there's just no way for us to get away from this. We need to work out how to do that engagement more often in a more fluid way that it is not so staged and structured and maximizes the hard to reach voices and everything else, because I think there's a lot of inertia around consultation. Generally, people get quite bored by it, and actually, if you can make it local and mean something to the people there, then they are much more likely to engage in that, and what you get out will be much more valuable. So it's working out, what it is the people there need, and then how to achieve that. Because I think. So as I'm not a planner, I'm actually an economist, but as workers in this area, as professionals, we need to work together to be bespoke and dynamic, I think, in that participation as well. That's a really important bit of what I've learned through this process and kind of longer term.
Thanks very much. I've allowed things to overrun, but there may well be people who are now desperate for a comfort break as a consequence. And I apologise we weren't able to get through all the questions. There's a lot of information in what our speakers have said today, a lot of links and follow-ups, and more to come by the sounds of it as well from the work that's coming out of all of your organisations. So thanks very much for your time today. Just for the next session, I'm going to go to a break now, and we'll come back at 12:25 instead of 12:15. So that'll give people just the opportunity to make themselves a cup of tea. But thanks again to all of our speakers, to Sarah, to Mike, and to Stefanie.
Anyone can follow up those questions to me directly, no problem.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That's great.
Thanks very much.
See you all soon. Cheers.
Bye.
12:25.
Bye.
Yep. 12:25 for a restart. Okay.